Francis Perkins and the Triangle Factory Fire. History Writing by David Brooks. Today, the area around Washington Square Park in Lower Manhattan is surrounded by New York University, expensive apartments, and upscale stores. But back in 1911, there were nice brownstones on the northern side of the park and factories on its eastern and southern sides, drawing young and mostly Jewish and Italian immigrant workers. One of the nice homes was owned by Mrs. Gordon Norrie, a society matron descended from two of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. On March 25th, Mrs. Norrie was just sitting down to tea with a group of friends when they heard a commotion outside. One of her guests, Francis Perkins, then 31, was from an old but middle-class Maine family, which could also trace its lineage back to the time of the Revolution. She had attended Mount Holyoke College and was working at the Consumers League of New York, lobbying to end child labor. A butler rushed in and announced that there was a fire near the square. The ladies ran out. Perkins lifted up her skirts and sprinted toward it. They had stumbled upon the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, one of the most famous fires in American history. Perkins could see the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building ablaze, and dozens of workers crowding around the open windows. She joined the throng of horrified onlookers on the sidewalk below. Some saw what they thought were bundles of fabric falling from the windows. They thought the factory owners were saving their best material. As the bundles continued to fall, the onlookers realized they were not bundles at all. They were people hurling themselves to their death. People had just begun to jump as we got there, Perkins would later remember. They had been holding on until that time, standing in the windowsills, being crowded by others behind them, the fire pressing closer and closer, the smoke closer and closer. They began to jump. The window was too crowded, and they would jump and they hit the sidewalk, she recalled. Every one of them was killed. Everybody who jumped was killed. It was a horrifying spectacle. The firemen held out nets, but the weight of the bodies from that great height either yanked the nets from the firemen's hands or the bodies ripped right through. One woman grandly emptied her purse over the onlookers below and then hurled herself off. Perkins and the others screamed up to them, "Don't jump! Help is coming!" It wasn't. The flames were roasting them from behind. 47 people ended up jumping. One young woman gave a speech before diving, gesticulating passionately, but no one could hear her. One young man tenderly helped a young woman onto the windowsill. Then he held her out, away from the building, like a ballet dancer, and let her drop. He did the same for a second and a third. Finally, a fourth girl stood on the windowsill. She embraced him, and they shared a long kiss. Then he held her out and dropped her, too. Then he himself was in the air. As he fell, people noticed, as his pants ballooned out, that he wore smart tan shoes. One reporter wrote, "I saw his face before they covered it. You could see in it that he was a real man. He had done his best." The fire had started at about 4:40 that afternoon, when somebody on the 8th floor threw a cigarette or a match into one of the great scrap heaps of cotton left over from the tailoring process. The pile quickly burst into flames. Somebody alerted the factory manager, Samuel Bernstein, who grabbed some nearby buckets of water and dumped them on the fire. They did little good. The cotton scraps were explosively flammable, more so than paper, and there was roughly a ton of the stuff piled on the 8th floor alone. Bernstein dumped more buckets of water on the growing fire, but by this point they had no effect whatsoever, and the flames were spreading to the tissue paper patterns hanging above the wooden work desks. He ordered workers to drag a fire hose from a nearby stairwell. They opened the valve, but there was no pressure. As a historian of the fire, David von Draley has argued, Bernstein made a fatal decision in those first 3 minutes. He could have spent the time fighting the fire or evacuating the nearly 500 workers. Instead, he battled the exploding fire to no effect. If he had spent the time evacuating, it is possible that nobody would have died that day. When Bernstein finally did take his eyes off the wall of fire, he was astonished by what he saw. Many of the women on the 8th floor were taking the time to go to the dressing room to retrieve their coats and belongings. Some were looking for their time cards so they could punch out. Eventually, the 2 factory owners up on the 10th floor were alerted to the fire, which had already consumed the 8th floor and was spreading quickly to their own. One of them, Isaac Harris, gathered a group of workers and figured it was probably suicidal to try to climb down through the fire. "Girls, let us go up on the roof. Get on the roof," he bellowed. The other owner, Max Blank, was paralyzed by fear. He stood frozen with a look of terror on his face, holding his youngest daughter in one arm and his elder daughter's hand with the other. A clerk, who was evacuating with the firm's order book, decided to throw it down and save his boss's life instead. Most of the workers on the 8th floor were able to get out, but the workers on the 9th floor had little warning until the fire was already upon them. They ran like terrified schools of fish from one potential exit to another. There were 2 elevators, but they were slow and overloaded. There was no sprinkler system. There was a fire escape, but it was rickety and blocked. On normal days, the workers were searched as they headed home to prevent theft. The factory had been designed to force them through a single choke point in order to get out. Some of the doors were locked. As the fire surrounded them, the workers were left to make desperate life-and-death decisions with limited information in a rising atmosphere of fire, smoke, and terror. 3 friends, Ida Nelson, Katie Weiner, and Fanny Lansner, were in the changing room when the screams of fire reached them. Nelson decided to sprint for one of the stairwells. Weiner went to the elevators and saw an elevator car descending the shaft. She hurled herself into space, diving onto the roof. Lansner took neither course and didn't make it out. Mary Buccelli later described her own part in the vicious scramble to get out first. "I can't tell you because I gave so many pushes and kicks. I gave and received. I was throwing them down wherever I met them," she said of her coworkers. "I was only looking for my own life. At a moment like that, there is big confusion, and you must understand that you cannot see anything. You see a multitude of things, but you can't distinguish anything. With the confusion and the fight that you take, you can't distinguish anything." Joseph Brenman was one of the relatively few men in the factory. A crowd of women were pushing between him and the elevators, but they were small, and many of them were faint. He shoved them aside and barreled his way onto the elevator and to safety. The fire department arrived quickly, but its ladders could not reach the 8th floor. The water from its hoses could barely reach that high, just enough to give the building exterior a light dousing. Shame. The horror of the